First speaker Natalie Morris, second speaker Peggy Powell, third speaker Jonathan Flew, and the reply speaker will also be done by Natalie Morris. Opposing this motion is Zimbabwe. First speaker Ken Watt, second speaker Tatlin Jovana, third speaker Tapu Mbutsi, and the reply speech will be done by Ken Watt. Our adjudicators are, chief adjudicator is Mr. Asher Weil from Israel, and he's accompanied by Salman Hyde from England and Miss Virginia Parkson from Lithuania.
Ladies and gentlemen, I do not profess to be an artist in any way or to be very good at drawing, in fact, but I do believe still that the government has a duty to fund the arts. But basically, what do we mean by a government? The government is the highest authority and administrative body in the country and has a large pool of resources, basically. But more importantly, the duty of the government to its people is not solely a physical one. It is also an emotional and intellectual responsibility to its people in terms of their development in this area. They have to look after holistic social welfare and broadly in terms of developing social unity and equity, as well as developing civil maturity and social vibrancy. Also, ladies and gentlemen, another key issue and another key term that we have to understand is the whole notion of the arts. Now, the arts are basically a form of expression in various forms of media. We have, for example, the visual arts, like sculpture, as well as painting. We have performance arts, like drama and dance, as well as literature. And when we say that the government has a duty to arts, we're saying that it has a duty to provide some form of financial backing in a variety of ways. For example, by subsidizing the costs of production, like in terms of venues, as well as ticket prices, and as well as providing grants to artists in need. Now, this will be done by an independent review commission, as it is done in Italy today. For example, and this will consist of respected members of the artistic community, by elected members of parliament, members of civil organizations, as well as representatives from minority groups in the country. And basically, this independent review commission is there to oversee the decision-making process in terms of the distribution of the funds, as well as allocation of these funds. Now, these of course will be done according to a clear criteria to ensure that this form of decision-making will not be arbitrary. But ladies and gentlemen, let's first make some clarifications to set the ground straight. Now, this government, the duty of the government, although we say is to fund, it is not to provide the sole source to artists in society. Of course, we will still allow for grounds of private benefactors, as well as contributions by charitable organizations. Similarly, we do not say that the government should divert all their resources into funding the arts, and such that you divert them away from social welfare programs like education, like health, but still we say that it should be an important component of the government's social policy in budget allocation. Also, ladies and gentlemen, today's debate is not relevant in extreme situations of war-torn countries and countries undergoing dire poverty, because these issues will then not be one for consideration, let alone debate. But we do say, however, that we talk about this debate where funding by the government for the arts is practically feasible. So basically, on this side of the house, what we'll be showing you is that the government has a duty to fund the arts, because in this way, we're able to achieve some form of holistic social benefit. And I will talk about, first of all, the stimulation of social cultural development, while my second speaker will talk about benefits to the audience as a whole. And together with Jonathan, as a team, we will definitely prove that today's motion must stand. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me talk about my first point, the stimulation of social cultural development. We all have the conventional image of artists, how they live from hand to mouth, how their form of art is the sole means of sustenance. It's very much of a bread and butter issue for them. And we have images that pop to mind, images like Jean-Michel Basquiat, who's a painter in his time, and basically he struggled to make a living through his art form, through his entire life. But in the end, he died in poverty and obscurity. And it is these images that are somehow some form of a disincentive for individuals to move into the career of the arts, to pursue a career in the arts. Yes, sir.
Ma'am, are you moving the government should fund people on a personal basis then, as opposed to the arts as an industry in general?
Yes, sir. I am saying that artists can apply for certain subsidies and grants, as well as the arts as a whole. So generally, we encourage some form of vibrancy in the art scene. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, because of the image, the traditional and conventional image of artists, we basically have a disincentive for individuals to move into this art scene. And this therefore undermines the development of the vibrancy of the art and prevents the achievement of the benefits of the art. The benefits being two main ones, which I will be focusing on today: the development of social maturity, and second of all, how it binds the community through a form of cultural identity that is engendered. Then it is therefore, we say, the duty of the government to achieve these benefits, and this can be done by funding. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, the whole notion of the development of social maturity. Now, the arts are often used as a platform for social issues, because how it happens in the course of the arts is how you analyze stereotypes, you encourage debate and discussion through the platforming of these social issues. For example, we see Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, which exposed the practical realities of the American dream. And what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that when you have funding from the government, some form of sustenance for these artists is thus ensured, and more individuals will be attracted into the art scene, and therefore employing the form of art as a medium of expression, as a medium for platforming in social issues, contributing in a moment, sir, contributing to an environment that will be viable for awareness and social maturity. Yes, sir.
Ma'am, if artists whose works, shall we call them, are not successful, reach for funding from the government and their works continue not to be successful, does this not breed a dependency on the part of the artists?
No, sir. I tell you that in certain cases whereby traditional art forms, for example, are not going to be successful, we need to continue with funding them because of how important they are to the notions of cultural identity. And in the end, because people recognize this form of importance of cultural identity, it will pick up speed, though, thank you, sir, in the end, and therefore some form of support from the people. But first of all, ladies and gentlemen, let me substantiate my first point, how France's Center for National Cinematography, I beg pardon my French, subsidizes films like The Widow of Saint Pierre, which talks about family relations and widows, as well as about the modern concept of religion. And that is how, ladies and gentlemen, it engendered some form of discussion. Similarly, with To Kill a Mockingbird, whose staging was funded by the Canadian government and engendered discussion into racial issues, which was revamped again in the whole Canadian society. And therefore, because of this increased social awareness, we tell you of the government's responsibility and duty to fund the arts. Second of all, the notion of binding the community through some form of cultural identity that is engendered. Now, this is my point on traditional arts that are often neglected by corporate and private benefactors because they look out for commercial viability and solely look out for profit often. And that is why the traditional arts seldom have these forms of funding and often have the threat of dying out. But ladies and gentlemen, the duty of the government is to preserve these forms of traditional identities because they're traditional, because they're part of a cultural heritage, and because of how it provides the people with common ground, with a form of common history. It is able to provide them with the means through which to bind the community. And therefore we say there is need for the government to step in and make up for financial shortfalls, which in fact is what the Indonesian government did with wayang kulit and how they stimulated youth interest, therefore allowing for wayang kulit to become more vibrant in today's world as a traditional art form even. Similarly, this was done with the Thai government and Balinese dance, and the Taiwanese government and Oriental opera. So what they did, ladies and gentlemen, was to export these traditional arts to the region, therefore allowing them to survive in today's world. And because of these reasons of societal welfare and societal benefit, we say yes, the government should fulfill this duty and fund the arts.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. To begin with, I would like to outline how my team and I plan on going about the business of opposing today's motion, and that being that of the government funding the arts. To begin with, I will rebut and touch upon a few of the issues that have been brought up by the opposition and by the proposition team, and show you why we consider these propositions of theirs either to be unnecessary or unviable. I will then go on to give you solutions of our own as to how the art industry can continue to grow and develop without any direct financial involvement from the government. And I will give you some examples of how we intend to achieve this. My second speaker will then go on to show you why we think it is important that the government should not be involved in the arts industry at a financial level. He will show you some of the detrimental effects that this can have, not only to the artists directly to themselves, but also how this can be abused by the government for political interests, etc. And he will also cite examples of certain countries in which such situations are applicable. My third speaker will then go on to rebut the points that are brought up by the proposing team and to further highlight any key issues that may have been left over during the debate. Now, to move on to the rebuttal of some of the issues they brought up, they have spoken of things like the intellectual development, etc. of a country. Now, we completely agree with this, but we believe that it is not necessary for the government to be funding the arts industry in order for this to take place. Now, we believe very, very strongly that subsidies by the government are not completely necessary to the development. What we propose instead is that the government should waive certain things that are needed. For example, they mentioned things like which certain artistic events take place, whether it be dance, ballet, shows of art pieces in museums, etc. Instead of actually giving money or subsidizing by taking money out of their pockets, and ladies and gentlemen, this is money that could be used other places, the government should simply waive the need for this. If the building's in existence, there is no need for anyone for money to pass hands. The government can make a gesture of goodwill in which it passes, it waives the need for someone to pay. No, thank you. Not yet. Another point they brought up was that of funding individual artists. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as the opposing team, we have a very strong feeling against this. The reason being is, as the first speaker from the proposing team mentioned, she said that a case of dependency would not arise. Now, we believe this is absolutely not the case, ladies and gentlemen. As we have stated, not everyone is a good artist. They may be an artist, but they are not necessarily a good artist. Not yet, thank you. Now, what happens if that artist continually produces paintings or songs or write books that do not sell? They cannot be marketed. They're of no value because, to be quite honest, they're not up to a certain standard. That's not yet, thank you, sir. That person depends upon the funding that is coming in from the state because the proposition team has proposed funding individuals. Now, this means we're going to have a nation of so-called artists, ladies and gentlemen, who produce things willy-nilly, whether or not they're of quality, and rely upon the state to fund them and give them a living. No, thank you, ma'am. The result of this, in fact, is not going to be the promotion of a strong, solid cultural, artistic heritage, but in fact, the reduction of such a thing. Because anyone can produce whatever they want, and they know they will receive funding from the state. Now, ladies and gentlemen, another point that was brought up is that traditional arts usually suffer if they are not funded, because no one has the ability to market them. And I think they mentioned was that of companies that wish to make a profit out of the art. Now, we would like to completely oppose this idea, ladies and gentlemen, by saying that traditional arts are in fact the thing that cause tourists to come to a country in order to view it. When you go to a foreign country, you don't want to go there in order to see the exact same things you could stay at home. That you could do just as easily in your own local museum. When you travel abroad, you want to experience the culture and the national heritage of that country in the same way we experienced the dancing in Soweto yesterday. That is a vital and integral part of South Africa's culture, and so that's what you wish to experience. Yes, sir.
But we put it to you that in the numerous cases where these cultural heritages are dying, like with Wayakulit, like with Oriental Opera, we tell you that there is a concrete need for the government to step in and fulfill the duty of financing its own cultural heritage, sir.
So I accept the point that the government should step in, but I completely oppose the fact that the government should fund it. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's go back to the point they brought up about multinational companies or local companies that have to invest in the arts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this would bring to the first point that I wish to highlight today, or one of the first points I wish to highlight today, is that combined integrating tourism, which is a big money-spinning industry, and the arts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as they have mentioned, certain traditional arts need extreme amounts of exposure and money, and there are companies that have that money. Now, opposed to the idea that they would have us believe that these companies want nothing to do with traditional arts, we firmly believe that if a company takes on an arts group or a certain sector of the arts and promotes it and sells the idea abroad in order to receive tourists coming in a minute, ma'am. This is very good for both the arts because they're receiving the funding necessary and the exposure necessary to grow and develop. And it's also at the same time good for the company within that country, thereby promoting another industry within the country because the company that is promoting these arts stands to make money if they bring in more tourists than is normal. Yes, ma'am.
With regards to tourism, you're only talking about a small sector of the cultural enterprise when you're only talking about them being retained in a certain commercially attractive form. We're asking for traditional art forms to be retained for the good of the community.
Ma'am, if you've been listening, this is exactly what I'm going on. I will cite an example of Zimbabwe to clarify this for you. In Zimbabwe, we have various forms of traditional dancing, and one of the major minority dances is known as Shangaan dancing. this was a type of dance that had never really been heard of, even by people within Zimbabwe. However, there is a company called the Zimbabwe Tourism Authority. They're a solely profit-making organization, just the same as any other company is. This company affiliated themselves with this type of traditional dancing. They have not in any way or form changed it or placed restrictions upon the artists, which means that this art form is preserved in the way it was from the beginning. No, thank you, ma'am. This Zimbabwe Tourism Authority has been marketing this to foreign visitors, and as part of their tourist package, they offer you a trip to go and see this type of traditional dance. So at the same time, they're making money for themselves, they're making money for these people who do this dance, and they're promoting and not changing the very essence of this dance.
Point, sir.
No, thank you, ma'am. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to move on to another thing that we would like to talk about, and that is of priorities. Now, the proposition said we should not take into account countries that are involved in wars or extreme poverty, and we agree with this. However, I believe we should look to semi-developed and developing nations who have a relative level of peace and a relative level of stability. These nations, in order to continue development, need extremely large amounts of money to continue to be channeled into health, education, and social security. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as the proposition team has implied to us, we do not need to put the entire government's budget into paying for these amenities. However, we believe the more we can have in these, the faster the nations can develop. Now, the faster a nation develops, the more attractive it is for tourists to come in and see cultural heritage. Therefore, we believe it is extremely important that the money is used in these sectors. And we see no reason, ladies and gentlemen, why a country should not use as much money as it can to improve the lives of its citizens, when in fact an industry such as the arts industry can be handled by the organizations that we have mentioned, for example, organizations that have a mutual relationship with a particular art industry, and both of them make money out of it. So, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the arts industry has the potential to be self-sustaining and does not need government funding, and so we beg to oppose the motion. And thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, being an avid follower of the television series Xena, the Warrior Princess, I, the same as Natalie, have no claims to artistic integrity, because the only amount of artistic creativity that I'm sorry to say is probably with regards to how many ways leather can be worn on the human body. But despite that, ladies and gentlemen, I still see the need clearly for government to fund the arts. And why do I say this? Because in three main areas, the argument on the opposition side has been severely flawed. And I'm going to deal with this in three main areas. Firstly, the so-called argument that it's not necessary. Secondly, the argument that there's not enough money to do it. And finally, the small point on the dependency of unsuccessful artists or art organizations. Now on the first point, ladies and gentlemen, that side of the House told us that the government should instead waive things such as rentals, such as payments for use of facilities. Now in the first place, who, I ask, then is going to pay for the building maintenance? The point is, in the end, there is still a social cost to be incurred, and the government still has to pay for this, if not the artists themselves, ladies and gentlemen. So they're being extremely naive for suggesting this so-called solution. Now furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, we ask you, by already conceding that the government should take some kind of intervention in art organizations to date by waiving these kind of payments, then what is the difference between this kind of subsidy and the kind of grants and subsidies that we ourselves are proposing? In fact, we tell you that the real alternative in the real world is going to be commercial entities. And commercial entities do not have the macro perspective of the government, nor the long-term interests of the people at heart to maintain the cultural identity of the society, ladies and gentlemen. And this is precisely where the arguments on tourism, once again, doesn't stand. Because firstly, I tell you that the amount of art that is maintained in its integrity is going to be the very small proportion of it. Only the proportion that is so-called commercially attractive to, for example, Western foreigners. Now, for example, I give you the hula dances in Hawaii, which everybody is aware of, ladies and gentlemen. But I'm sorry, coconut shells and grass skirts do not exactly make up the cultural integrity that we so want to maintain. They talked about the art forms that are being maintained in Zimbabwe, and we respect that, ladies and gentlemen. But respectfully, we also remind them that perhaps weighing up Zimbabwean art forms with the so-called hula girls in Hawaii, there is going to be a clear advantage for those that are commercially attractive, and in the long run we say it is only those that are going to maintain themselves and not even in the forms which you would want.
Points of information.
No, thank you, sir. Now, and therefore, ladies and gentlemen, also bearing in mind that even if all these alternatives were to be put into practice, that does not cancel out the idea that the government should, in its own authority, also step in and help out where it should, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, this whole argument on alternatives doesn't really stand. Now, let's deal with this point on how there's not enough money. Now, they talked about semi-developed countries and said, well, we want to improve the lives of its citizens. Well, ladies and gentlemen, there are tangible benefits and there are intangible benefits. What we're talking about here is intangible benefits to the welfare, spiritual and intellectual of its citizens. Now, I give you the example of Singapore itself, ladies and gentlemen, where you will agree it is a very economically developed country, but the government is already realizing its mistakes in not trying to maintain the spiritual welfare and the identity of the people, ladies and gentlemen. And it's in these cases that we tell you it's so important for the government not to neglect this important spiritual part of budget allocation. Yes, sir.
But you also mentioned that government has a duty to sustain the everyday needs of these artists.
Yes, sir, precisely. We're saying that firstly, not all the budget will be channeled to the arts, and secondly, this will maintain the everyday welfare of artists, therefore promoting artistic creation. Now, on this last point, on the dependency of unsuccessful artists. Now, the proposition resents this implication that just because you're not commercially successful means that you should just go and die and wither in the dumps somewhere, ladies and gentlemen. But the point is, what exactly determines the success of an art? Sometimes it's not necessarily artistic integrity. If we had followed their kind of logic, ladies and gentlemen, wayang kulit in Indonesia, which was highly unpopular because it was so-called not as popular, would have died out, and we would not have the kind of richness to the ethnic fabric which contributes to Indonesia today. Don't you agree, sir?
Oh, sorry, I thought you didn't end me. And the point I want to bring up is that, don't you believe that if we have a case where a state supports every single artist who's not successful, there is a major risk that the quality of the art that's being produced by these artists...
No, sir, I don't agree, because we've already brought up this idea of an independent review commission with clear criteria. So if, in the rare case that this project continually and abjectly continues to prove itself utterly devoid of any artistic value whatsoever, ladies and gentlemen, then the Independent Review Commission has it in its power to stop the grants and the subsidies. So that also deals with the point on the perpetual dependency of unsuccessful artists. Not everyone and anyone can just feed off the state. No, thank you, sir, ladies and gentlemen, because we've already put forward clear mechanisms to prevent this. So now, let's move on to my case. No, thank you, madam. My case has to deal with the benefits to audiences as a whole because of the funding of the arts. Now, ladies and gentlemen, through direct subsidies for tickets and the decreased cost of production, we see a decreased cost involved in just merely watching the performance itself, which is important because many so-called highbrow art forms nowadays are prohibitively expensive, ladies and gentlemen, meaning that they're only easily accessible to a certain elite rank of society. For example, the Paris Opera Ballet. I'm not going to try to pronounce the French name. The average ticket received, ladies and gentlemen, costs £65. Now, for the 60% of society with an average income of £1,000 and below, ladies and gentlemen, we put forward to you this prohibitively expensive, and they are no part of this. In Taiwan, for example, the Taipei Opera, with an average ticket of 100 Taipei, or Taiwanese currency, the average income of the bottom 50% of society being 800 Taipei. It is obviously too large a proportion of their normal average income for them to participate in these so-called highbrow art forms. Which means, ladies and gentlemen, that these add to the fundamental inequities or differences between classes in society already. We're not saying that the differences in arts accessibility is the main reason for this inequity, but we're saying that if funding can reduce the costs and therefore increase accessibility, then why not in this area? And we can in fact decrease the costs, increasing across the board accessibility. For example, the Singapore Dance Theatre itself, when it decreased prices by 20%, saw an increased attendance by people who were not previously attending and by people who are not from the top 30% of wage earners in society, ladies and gentlemen. So what we see is that not only do the benefits of art, such as creative expression, enjoyment and appreciation accrue to the community as a whole, but also it removes previous social divides and upholds the duty of the government to ensure that benefits are equitably distributed, ladies and gentlemen. The proposition does not like the idea that just because you are wealthy, you are allowed to enjoy the benefits of high art forms. We do not like the idea that because of differences in prices that we cannot afford, there are going to be these fundamental inequities in society, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, we say that we should have government funding to allow for holistic enjoyment of the arts in the community. Now, along with my first speaker's point on how it maintains the artistic integrity as well as traditional identity of a people, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you indeed that the government should have a duty to maintain the welfare, not just the tangible welfare, the economic welfare, but also the spiritual welfare of a people, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, this side of the House maintains firm in its belief that the government should support the arts, especially if it's Selina, the warrior princess.
Good morning to you, adjudicators, fellow speakers, ladies and gentlemen, few as you may be. Now, I'd like to begin our argument this morning by refuting a number of points that have been made by the team in proposition of this topic. Firstly, they talked about an independent review commission that would be set up to overlook or to oversee issues pertaining to the arts. Ladies and gentlemen, we argued this day that the fact that it is independent in itself would dissociate it from the government. If in fact it was an independent review commission set up by government, then it would not be independent. And so that point is not clearly understood by us in opposition of this topic. Now, ladies and gentlemen, they also talked about private benefactors who have been known to be selfish or not have the interests of the community in these countries at heart. We would actually agree with this point to the extent that greedy people do exist. But we also put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that governments themselves can be greedy. How? In the sense that they too can have interests that they seek to pursue, which are not necessarily artistic, but can be political. Because governments by nature are not made up of artists, but by politicians. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the opposition, no thank you. The opposition has said that the government funding of the arts would revive the arts and lead to their engenderment in society. What they chose to ignore for argument is that it is possible to support something without necessarily funding it. You can support something, ladies and gentlemen, without necessarily funding, and it's this that we also want to make very clear. Now, first speaker, Mr. Board, has already mentioned that the independent funds may be more preferable than government per se. Now, we, ladies and gentlemen, do not know, thank you, ma'am. We, ladies and gentlemen, do not feel that it is the duty of government to fund the arts. I would like to show you why the proposition's argument that the government cannot work for this, why the proposition's argument that the government should fund it cannot work. For the simple reason that the government is the government, as I already mentioned, and the arts is the arts. I will explain now what I mean. Now, what we believe in opposing this motion is that the arts, by definition, are the richest aspect of human expression. On that point, the proposition, to a certain extent, agrees with us. Now, expression is what we strongly believe would be taken out of the arts were the government to have the duty of funding. Now, we must understand, no thank you ma'am, we must understand, ladies and gentlemen, that the government is a group of people, a small group of people whose primary interests, as I've mentioned before, are political ones and not artistic ones. We therefore argue that making it the duty of the government to fund the arts would cause a number of problems for not only the arts themselves, but the people in the nation. And this would contradict the point that the proposition have made. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me give you an example. When Mr. Gavin Peter, our beloved coach, takes his money to Old Mutual to set up a trust fund or an asset management account, he wants the money that he is investing to do positive things and reap benefits for him. He must ultimately find this money to be to his use, to his benefit, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, he will want to a great degree, depending on how much money he invests, of course, control of this money. In In the same way, if the government was to invest, just a moment, if the government was to invest money in funding the arts, they would obviously have interests to pursue, and those interests would be political. Yes, ma'am.
We tell you that this logic is especially applicable to commercial entities who are not altruistic and therefore focus on a small niche area of the art forms and therefore do not cater to an entire range of arts.
Yes, ma'am, but we have also argued and put it to you that governments themselves can also be selfish and can also not have the interest of the whole society at large. I can give you the example of certain nations which are now turning into dictatorships where it has been known and has been proven that it is not the interest of the people at large that they have. And so it is not all governments that have the interest of their people at large. And this is why we disagree with that point. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we object to this because this would take three important aspects or dimensions out of us. Firstly, the dynamism of the arts. Thank you, ma'am. Secondly, the freedom to express. And thirdly, the vibrance. No, thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, when you are told how to use your money, you are limited in your ideas about how to use that money. And so when looking at arts itself, there can be no limit in art. We propose the possible limit in the idea that can be expressed in the arts if government were to fund arts. Now, governments would likely limit the number of anti-government, for example, or songs, films, no thank you, ma'am, and books, because it would not do their political life any good. Let me give you a solid example, which can be given of a Zimbabwean singer, Oliver Mtukudzi, whose latest album, by the name of Vumatore, was banned because of its anti-government stance. Now, ladies and gentlemen, yes.
We tell you that this can be avoided with the help of the independent review commission we have put forth that will aid the government in their decision making.
But the whole independent aspect of it is taken out if they are working in collaboration with the government. This we have made to you. Now, going back to my example of the Zimbabwean musician, this we can even see because the artist himself was not funded by government. He was not funded by government, and yet he, because of his anti-government stance in his songs, was banned. Now, we put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, to this question: how much more an artist who had actually been funded by government? He would only have been banned even more, probably sent out of the country for failing to use the money that he had been given by government to good use. Ladies and gentlemen, we have presented a number of points, obviously refuting the issue of the, no thank you sir, of the Independent Review Commission, because we have made it very clear to you that the independent aspect of it, working in this liaison with government, is not an option. It does not work. Government and independent, it takes away the independent aspect of it. That point we have tried to make clear. Secondly, we have also put it to you that it is possible for us to understand, it is reasonable for us to suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that it is not all governments who have the interests of their people at heart, as the proposition would put you. That it is governments who have, in fact, the desire to see their people more engendered in the issues concerning the arts. We have refuted that, ladies and gentlemen, for the simple reason that governments too, just like private benefactors, can be greedy. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we are entirely in disagreement with the motion that governments have the duty of funding the arts. Thank you.
Waiting for the second speaker of the opposition to kick-start the debate about wearing leather, but unfortunately he decided not to take that tack. But actually he didn't take any tack at all, ladies and gentlemen, because he never addressed the constructives on our side of the house directly. He fails to recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that in the majority circumstance, where we have democratization across the world and the consequent checks and balances that come with that to government abuse, as I'll expound on later, ladies and gentlemen, and where there is this option of funding actually being put to good use, government funding of the arts, you'll see a concrete benefit in terms of the development of social maturity, of cultural awareness, and the preservation of the cultural heritage that binds our communities together, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why we're talking about government funding of the arts today. First of all, let me make a clarification before I go on to the two broad issues I'm talking about, ladies and gentlemen. The first issue of funding, and there being other means of funding, and finally the whole notion of the practical consequences of funding. But first of all, let me do this clarification. I'd like to clarify the independent committee, because we point you to the fact, from the very beginning, we told you that this committee will be independent in the sense of the specific case-by-case decision-making process. The case-by-case allocation of funds will be conducted in an independent decision-making process, an independent consultative decision-making process. But the funding as a whole will derive from the government. And that's why our specific policy, as implemented in Italy and France, ladies and gentlemen, and that's your real-world model for you, can straddle both the demands of practical necessity, ladies and gentlemen, raised by both sides of the House. We tell you that there is a government need. There's a need for the government to fulfill the macro interest. And at the same time, they tell you there is a need to ensure that their macro interest is served in an equitable way. And if you bother to deal with our specific policy, ladies and gentlemen, you recognize that as a whole, we have been able to fulfill the needs of society best. But let's move on to my first point, that of funding. We tell you that first of all, just because there are other means of funding doesn't prohibit the government from providing more financing to increase the scale of benefit, which both sides agree on, ladies and gentlemen. And here's where they talk about the fact that there are countries with other priorities. Yes, there are many strains of government surpluses. But first of all, ladies and gentlemen, let me point you to the fact that there are budget surpluses throughout the developed world. There's a $4.3 trillion budget surplus in America, ladies and gentlemen, and that's why where we can, as they agree with, ladies and gentlemen, there's no reason why we should preemptively dismiss this as a whole, that this policy should be applied in cases where we can. And we tell you that even in the countries which we talk about, ladies and gentlemen, developing countries, we can do it as well. Because we're not demanding a total diversion from the necessary health and education programs which we talk about. We just demand consideration of the funding of arts as a part of the government's social policy. And when we see the benefit that derives from the arts, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of developing social maturity, we see that it's no different from institutional education as well. It's just a separate means to promote your policy of civil awareness and the development of society as a whole. So there's no reason why we shouldn't be putting it on equal weightage with education expenditure. Then they talk about tourism, ladies and gentlemen, and we've consistently reiterated the problem with relying on commercial companies through tourism as the sole source of funds for traditional art forms is that these art forms are often diluted to becoming purely entertainment. The reason why the Indonesian government, ladies and gentlemen, had to provide an alternative source of funding for wayang kulit, which is a form of shadow puppetry, ladies and gentlemen, is that rather than being retained in its original form of depicting the relationship between man and God, in its touristy incarnation, ladies and gentlemen, it became a body punch and Judy show. And that's the difference. That what we know about Hawaiian culture today is only about coconut bra husk, which quite frankly I have no personal opposition to, ladies and gentlemen. But I think in the interest of the Hawaiian cultural heritage as a whole, the government needs to provide an alternative source of funding. And finally, not all artistic forms are sustainable by tourism. Dance like by ballet, certain forms of drama, ladies and gentlemen, are amenable to the same kind of influx of tourist revenue which you talk about in these cases, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why we say the government has to step in to make up for the shortfall, to make the financing available. Let's move on to the second point on practical consequences, ladies and gentlemen. And when they talk about government abuse, we tell you that if the government is intent on suppressing the art forms, it can do so with or without funding. They talk about a ban, ladies and gentlemen, and that's a really, really simple way for a government, if it's intent on suppressing artistic development, to carry it out. Ladies and gentlemen, it is similarly applicable, hold on for a minute, sir, with or without funding. Yes.
So I would like to point out the fact that despite the fact that this album is banned, because it is independently funded, thousands and thousands of people across the country have got.
Thank you very much, sir. That's precisely the point. As I was going to go on to say, we've consistently reiterated that the government financing is not the only source of financing available. So if the government were not to ban it, ladies and gentlemen, and simply to withdraw its original source of funding, if it has artistic merit, like as in their own example they pointed out, ladies and gentlemen, on the international community, on private beneficiaries, to continue to sustain it, to continue to fuel the development. The point here is that often if we rely solely on private beneficiaries, there are many artistic forms which drop through the holes, ladies and gentlemen, and that's why where we need to step in is to complement that shortfall. That's why we say we have both private beneficiaries, but don't dismiss, ladies and gentlemen, the possibility of government financing. But let's talk about the likelihood of this abuse. And I point you to the fact that with an increasing rate of democratization throughout the world, the fact that governments are being elected and therefore amenable to public scrutiny means that the likelihood of this abuse is even lessened. We are not living under, unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, a dictatorship any longer. The point here is that what we have is a system of accountability, and that's why as a whole, and therefore specifically with regard to the arts, ladies and gentlemen, we can have the kinds of checks and balances that will prevent the suppression, that will prevent anything from hindering the social maturity of our people. Ladies and gentlemen, then they talk about developing a dependency. But we point you to an analogous example, ladies and gentlemen, like education. We tell you that many countries like Denmark have a system of free education, but we don't lament, ladies and gentlemen, this policy as being, well, terrible dependency. That's precisely because of the benefits it accrues in terms of developing social maturity, developing civic. And we tell you the government can do the same through a policy of funding the arts, because arts are often used to platform social issues and educate the people in a different form from the institutional dull and dim of the classroom. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, the entire policy as a whole is so complete. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, they want to talk about the fact that, well, there are cases where this will compromise quality. Here's the point. We told you that what we're going to do is carry out the allocation of funding in consultation with respected members of the artistic community, like it's carried out in France's Ministry of Culture, like it's carried out in Italy's National Council for Artistic Development, ladies and gentlemen. And that's why, as a whole, the policy works. It's been implemented before, and that's why we say, let's not allow a few minor considerations like leather to stand in the way. Let's develop our society, let's fund the arts.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, adjudicators and panel speakers. I'm here on behalf of my team to rebut and refute some of the issues that have been raised by the proposing team for this motion. When we looked at this motion, we tried to think about what is going on in a situation where the arts need the money and they need to be funded. So we prioritized what are the priorities, and the government has to look at the priorities in the situation. Where is the money needed most that could be going towards these arts? Secondly, for artists who don't have the funds, what are they going to look at? What are they going to do? And secondly, how are we going to control that funding issue? Firstly, the first speaker made the proposing team has mentioned about how by allowing the government to fund the arts, they're promoting national pride and the social side of it. Yes, we agree with that, but as my former speakers have said, we don't need the government to fund, we don't need the government to give money to do that. The government can promote that national pride and bind society together in other forms. And when we say this, we suggest that the government, if it really wants to allow people to be able to express themselves, it must ban censorship. It does not need to fund the arts, because in banning when a government starts to fund, that means, especially in places where there's corruption, it can pull strings. If they don't want something to be said that they know is going to be said by artists who are able to express it, no thank you. If they're going to be saying something about, oh, the government is taking our money, and then they put it in a play, for example. If the government is going to be funding that play and it does not want it to be shown, it's not going to allow it to happen. And that already is contradicting the freedom of expression that will be going on in that country, and people will not be able to know. And by that ignorance, that is already contradicting the whole aspect of bringing people together, because people don't know what's going on. Secondly, they went on to talk about budget allocation. Yes, they agreed with us that we need to set aside money for the priorities that need to be dealt with, the health, the education, perhaps even the war situations. And we agree with that, but what we say is that that money that is going into the arts could go into even helping the situations move faster, building more clinics. No, thank you. Building more clinics faster, helping people be educated, because it does not make sense to have, no, thank you. It does not make sense to have a situation where people know how to dance, know how to sing. The culture and the ethnic part of it will always be there, but it does not make sense to have that when people can't read and they have the chance to be able to be allowed to read or learn more things. And then one main thing that we noticed is that the proposing team has not gone about telling us how they're going to distinguish between an artist and someone who thinks they can just sing or they can just sketch things. How are they going to go through that selection process of choosing who are we going to fund for? Because anybody can come. No, thank you. Anybody can come and say, oh, I need money for a production, or I need money because I want to sing a solo or whatever. But how are they going to go about choosing that person, knowing that that is the right person that they need to be helping in a situation like that? And that is why we suggested that if there's no dependency of going to a government, just running when you need the money, that means that you yourself will know that if you want something, you will go out and look for the non-government organizations that we suggested setting up, for them to come and help you. That means that you yourself will become independent, and you can always get help from somewhere else. You don't necessarily have to go to the government.
You really made the point that certain art forms which are commercially viable might not have the kind of traditional integrity that the government has a welfare and interest in protecting.
Yes, that is so true, but by putting the government at the top, no matter what it is, it's still going to have a say in it. Which brings me to the next point that they raised, about having an independent body to work with the government in choosing who they can pay for, or who they can help. What happens in a situation where the government is as corrupt as can be, especially in developing countries? How do we know that? No, thank you. How do we know that the people that they are putting in the body are going to seriously have the interests of those artists who want to get their points across at heart? How do we know that? That is not a risk that we want to take. So by allowing those people, those artists, to actually go out for themselves and look for the money that they need, be able to look up for their own resources without having to depend on someone who's going to limit their expression, then that means that the art form that they're doing is really going to develop from there. They went on to talk about how, for example, in Indonesia, the puppet industry had been corrupted and how this whole thing of the art can become entertainment. That is really not an issue, because we believe that the same thing can happen with the government being in charge of it. If the government is there, going back to my first point, if the government has a say in what is being shown on TV, what is being heard on the radios, that means that the expression of the people and the artists is not being fulfilled. And also that independent body, going back to that point, where they had said that they can work with the government, cannot be 100% neutral in most situations, and therefore that means that there's a bias towards who's selected, and we cannot work with that, because that already means that people are being discriminated against, and that's not what we want. Because by having people being able to come up to the government and say that this is what we want, it means that certain people cannot be selected. And basically what we're trying to say is, if you're going to have the government not funding the situation, it limits what people can say and what people can do. And that already means suppression. No, thank you. That means that people are not as free to express themselves and to say what they want to say. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone. Right, to begin summarizing our case today, I would like to divide it quickly into two issues, which I will tell you about, and tell you how we have addressed them and how the opposition have failed to do so, and thus prove to you why we oppose the motion. I would like to start off by looking at one of the key issues here, is that of revenue generation. Now, none of the teams have denied this is an essential part of the means and survival of the art industry. Now, my team has put forth to you a proposition that we have proven through logical explanation and examples, such as that of the Zimbabwe Tourism Authority, that this is actually a viable option. Now, the proposing team have at no point in time actually denied the fact that this option does work. However, they've tried to put forth that it distorts the cultural heritage of a country. And again, this is something we came up and opposed and explained why. The main reason we have opposed that kind of view is the reason that these days tourists are becoming more and more aware of what they want. It's not like in the old days where you went to London, got chucked on a bus and were taken on a quick 2-minute ride across the city and shown what people thought you wanted to see. These days people want to actually see what the real heritage of a country is. And so, as we've explained to you, it is not only in the interest of, it is actually in the interest of the company that is providing these tourism packages to preserve that cultural heritage, so that when people come as tourists to that country, they see the real thing, and that is exactly what people want. Now, another aspect that has not been addressed by the proposing team is that of local tourism. As we all know, ladies and gentlemen, tourism happens on two levels, international and regional, as in local. You go and see the tourist sites in your own country. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as my third speaker and second speaker put to you, there is no way that the risk of cultural heritage being spoiled can exist when tourism exists on both these levels, because the locals know what it's supposed to be, and the internationals in the same turn expect to see that thing that is the real thing. So ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the idea of integrating tourism and culture is not only a very good idea, it's a very viable one, and one that allows the industry, both tourist and cultural art industry, independence. And this brings me on to the next point that we have highlighted to you again and again, and that is that of independence. Now, I'd like to stress this on 2 points. Independence in the art industry means no government interference. The arts, as we have expressed, are a form of self-expression. Once you start including politics into this, that essential element is lost. Now, the proposition team put to us the notion of an independent council, for example, that would monitor the arts and decide who gets funding. But at the same time, they contradicted themselves by saying the money, although the committee is independent, the money comes from the government. Now, whichever way you look at it, the end result is that the money is coming from the government, and so at the end of the day, true independence has not been achieved. Now, why are we so afraid as the opposing team of having government involved? Well, for the simple reason of censorship, ladies and gentlemen. As my second speaker clearly explained and demonstrated to you, anyone with a financial stake in any industry whatsoever has a right, as someone who's putting in money, and also feels the right, and quite justifiably so, ladies and gentlemen, to exercise some form of control. The second control comes into play, ladies and gentlemen. As my team has pointedly expressed to you, both in our first and second speeches, the independence of the art is lost. Now, we have given you examples like that of Oliver Mtukudzi and many other examples, that it is extremely important that government not be involved, because anything in art that might be anti-government, we cannot suddenly say it's not an art form because it goes against the government. If that is the kind of self-expression and freedom of expression that the people choose to exercise, then it is justifiable, and the government cannot simply deny it because it goes against what they propose. So, ladies and gentlemen, another thing we'd like to say here is that all forms of tourism of art are important to take into consideration, and we believe the proposing team have not done that to a great enough extent. And so, ladies and gentlemen, with these views that we have given you, I beg you to oppose today's motion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to the reply speaker from opposition. We'll now hear from the last speaker of this debate, reply speaker of opposition, Natalie Morris.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Now, as today's debate, if we were talking about arts as leather, I'd say we wouldn't want funding. I'd rather be front row, because unlike my other two speakers on the team, I don't quite like leather so much. But seriously though, ladies and gentlemen, before I embark on the two main issues of today's debate, that of how the opposition has failed to see the need for government funding in the arts, and second of all, how they have basically been scaremongering about the detriments of government funding, let me first get something clear about our whole notion of the Independent Review Commission. Quite briefly, ladies and gentlemen, because we've talked about it really enough, and I'm sure everybody's quite clear about it, we're talking about an Independent Review Commission who is there for the government to consult, to guide the government. But ultimately, the funding, the money, comes from the government. And that is why we support the government's duty to fund the arts, their money to go into the arts, with guidelines from this Independent Review Commission. Having gotten that out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, the first major issue of today's debate, that was the need for government funding, which that side of the House failed to see. They told us about how there are commercial companies that through tourism will be able to fund the arts on their own, without proving to us the link, and only with giving us the sole example throughout this debate from that side of the House, that of Zimbabwe. But ladies and gentlemen, we dealt with their point all the same. We told you that with commercial companies, only small areas of the arts are focused upon because of the whole notion of a profit motive. And second of all, even if there was this form of funding, this whole notion of the arts will be turned to a mere form of entertainment, whereby the cultural heritage is ultimately not preserved in its traditional form, precisely because commercial companies only funded art where there was a coincidence of interests. Then we saw a furthering of a point on the side of the opposition in their summary speech, where they say the tourists actually know what they want. But how often, ladies and gentlemen, does this happen? They know what they want, sure, but do they know what they're getting is actually in the traditional form of the art in the first place? In fact, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you traditional art forms need to be maintained, and this can be done by government funding, and therefore help bind the community and national population because of cultural intent and the cultural identity being engendered. Then they started giving us this whole point about dependency. But then we asked you, what is wrong with this dependency? There are no detriments that accrue. And in fact, the quality of the art is not undermined with government funding. And in fact, it's also a means by which artists can lift off and get started. And that is why the need for government funding. We tell you this government should fulfill their duty to fund the arts. Now the second issue about how they've been scaremongering about the detriments, which I say scaremongering because they didn't really prove the detriments. They told us they'd go on to talk about dictatorships, but never really did. They merely focused on government abuse and how the freedom of expression is compromised. But we've already told them about how in the majority circumstance we're not faced with dictatorships in the world today. And furthermore, if the government really wanted to ban an art form, they'd do so anyway. And if they pulled up the funding, if it's a commercially viable form of art form, and it's something the international community values, then they can step in and fulfill this collapse in the funding that has occurred if the government were to pull out. This whole notion of health, education, and society, also, ladies and gentlemen, we've told you about the budget surplus, and therefore these tangible benefits will not be compromised. And in fact, we urge the opposition to look at the intangible benefits of the intellectual and emotional benefits that come when the government were to fund the arts. And in fact, ladies and gentlemen, on that side of the house, being the opposition, they failed to deal with our case. They failed to do with the fact that we will have increased access to the audience and alleviate some form of inequity with government funding for the arts. They failed to deal with the fact that we can engender some form of social maturity if the government were to fund the arts. So ladies and gentlemen, we urge you to see the intangible benefit. Let the government fund the arts.